The statements given here are extremely dense. The language itself makes this question that much difficult. It's an extremely difficult question. So let's start reading the statements and start building the connections alongside. Statement A says, the temptation to see the relationship among meaningful forms as imminent. Imminent, not imminent, not to be confused with imminent. Immanent means something intrinsic, something inherent. As consisting of some sort of intrinsic affinity they bear to one another is virtually overwhelming. What we understand is virtually overwhelming. Something which is overwhelming, something which is overpowering. What that is the temptation to see the relationship among meaningful forms as imminent. Now, the relationship among meaningful forms, this is something which would be given a name later on, but that is something which has not been named yet. So let's just keep that in mind. Statement B says, when we look for the constituents of cultural change or even cultural conflict, we are unable to find them resident in that of which they are presumably properties. Now, first off, we come closer to something which explains this, the relationship among meaningful forms or properties. B says, when we look for the constituents of cultural change, even cultural conflict, we are unable to find them resident in that of which they are presumably properties. So there is this aspect of culture coming in. We are not sure where it has come from. If culture is followed, then A might be our odd statement. Let's look further. Statement C says, and so we hear cultural integration spoken of as harmony of meaning, cultural change as an instability of meaning, and cultural conflict as an incongruity of meaning. Yet again, we come even closer to the term that we are necessarily looking for, and that is meaning. Meaning, properties, relationships. Let's keep this in mind, that these form a sort of relation. Meaning and properties, properties and relationships. These form a sort of relationship because these are referring to a certain word or a certain thing that we have still not been introduced yet. So we hear cultural integration spoken of as. Now, spoken of as is an important phrase here. It might seem like a filler in between words kind of phrase, but it's not. So cultural integration, harmony of meaning, cultural change, instability of meaning, cultural conflict, incongruity of meaning. It goes on and on, doesn't it? Statement D says, referring as it does both to formal principles of reasoning and to rational connections among facts and events, logic is a treacherous word, and nowhere more so than in the analysis of culture. Now, this here brings the entire circle to a close. This statement, it is in all probability near the beginning, if not at the very beginning of this particular passage. In any case, we are not unjumbling the passage. Don't worry about that. But it introduces these two words or phrases which are most important to us. First is logic, and the second is analysis of culture. So we have the analysis of culture justified. That actually puts our initial assertion that A might be the odd statement, that this puts it at question. This puts it into doubt. We'll see in a moment. Referring as it does to both to formal principles of reasoning and rational connections among facts and events, logic is a treacherous word, and nowhere more so than in the analysis of culture. We can build one more connection. Meaning, properties, relationships, all of this connect with the word logic. So let's look at E. The implication here is that harmony, instability, and incongruity are properties of meaning itself, as much as sweetness is a property of sugar or brittleness of glass. So we see a repeat of one of the words that we had marked, property. Property mentioned here and here. Both cases, at least in this particular instance, the same. When we say property, implication of harmony, instability, incongruity. This clearly connects with C, harmony of meaning, instability of meaning, incongruity of meaning. So all of these are properties of meaning itself, as much as sweetness is a property of sugar or brittleness of glass. So overall, the sleeper agent here, the silent premise of all these statements is the word logic. Logic mentioned here connects with these statements, also talks about culture. It introduces culture here. We could see that A probably comes before D, and then D brings in all of these statements. But then in that case, A is not the odd statement. Rather, we'll find that it is actually B that is the odd statement. Let's look at these statements quickly one more time. A says, let's first see all the statements which are similar. So A, C, D, and E. We started with D. Let's begin with A. The temptation to see the relationship among meaningful forms. Relationship among meaningful forms, another way of saying logic, as immanent, as consisting of some sort of intrinsic affinity they bear to one another, is virtually overwhelming. So the temptation to see connections, properties, logic, related relations, facts, between facts and events, connections, is overwhelming. Then we have C, which says, and so we hear cultural integration spoken of as. Let's clear this out a little bit. This is getting difficult to handle. So in all of this, we were talking about spoken of as. As we said, understanding meaningful connections, meaningful forms, relationships. So here we see the relationship between what is stated or what is heard and how it is understood. Culture and forms or aspects of culture and how they connect with the meaning of culture. So cultural integration as harmony of meaning, cultural change as instability of meaning, integration as harmony, change as instability, and conflict as incongruity. So these are connected by terms of logic. Then we have E, which presents these same facts. The implication here is that harmony, instability, and incongruity are properties of meaning itself, meaning also given by C. As much as sweetness is a property of sugar, brittleness of glass. Say glass is brittle, sugar is sweet. Similarly, meaning has harmony, instability, incongruity as its properties. So E can also be exempt, which means that we have cleared out 3 of these statements. We can be sure that A, C, and E are not the odd statements. Let's take a quick look at D, referring as it does to both to formal principles of reasoning and rational connections. While reasoning is something that is new over here, rational connections very well adds to or very well connects to relationships and properties and such words. Among facts and events, logic is a treacherous word, and nowhere more so than in the analysis of culture. This is where culture is brought in. So this is also quite close to the meaning that we are looking for, the premise that we are looking at. So D can be eliminated. Now we finally come to B. B says, constituents of cultural change. We could also call them connections, rational connections, properties. So properties of cultural change, constituents of cultural change, even cultural conflict. When we look for them, we are unable to find them resident in that of which they are presumably properties. So let's name something as X. Let's say that this X means culture. Then we say that if X is culture, then this when, if it represents the properties, if we look for cultural change, again, let's clear this out. If we look for cultural change, even cultural conflict, we would not find these these would not exist inside of this when. They would be outside of this when, of which they are presumably properties, which is in, now we can tell, direct contravention of the temptation, the overbearing, overwhelming temptation to see relationships among meaningful forms as immanent, as intrinsic, inborn, inherent, some sort of intrinsic affinity. If that be the case, then how can we say, how at all can we say that cultural change, part of culture, cultural conflict, part of culture, as we have seen here and then here repeatedly, are not part of culture, are not properties of culture? We are unable to find them as properties of culture. Makes no sense, goes directly against statement A and in essence against statements C, D, and E. So B is sufficiently different. The correct answer is B.